So let's take a close look at shutter priority. So when we're in shutter priority, that's S on most cameras, TV on a Canon camera, and when we're doing that, we're controlling time. We're controlling the amount of time that we let light into the camera, and the camera's deciding what aperture and ISO to apply to that, to our decision on how fast we take that picture. Now the great thing about shutter priority is that we can remove one of the most common problems with photographs, and that's camera shake and motion blur. So firstly, let's switch to S or TV, whatever camera you've got, and let's look at our shutter range on the camera. Now it varies camera to camera, so it does change. So on here I'm going to go one way, so as soon as that number goes 1 over 100, it will get, the bigger the number, the faster that is. So mine goes up to 1 over 8,000, that's 8,000th of a second. So 8,000th of a second, and now if I go down the other way, well, as soon as you start seeing an inch or quotation mark, you're starting to see seconds. So 0.8 is 0.8 seconds, 1 inch, 1 quotation is 1 second, and this will go to 30 seconds. So 30 inches or 30 quotation, that's 30 seconds. So it will vary camera to camera, but most cameras will do something like 15 seconds up to 2,000th, 4,000th of a second. And that's your shutter speed range. Now, in order to avoid camera shake and motion blur, I try and keep my shutter speed at something like 200th of a second and higher. And on bright days, I'll probably walk around with the camera at 500th of a second, because that really does increase or decrease the chance of getting camera shake and motion blur. Now it depends on what you are photographing and how heavy your camera and lens are. So with smaller cameras like this, you could probably get away with 100th or 60th of a second. But even when you're doing that, you just want to be aware that if anything's moving relatively quickly, you're going to get motion blur. And if you're sort of moving your hand around quite a lot, you're going to get motion blur or camera shake as well. So the great thing about this is that we can totally eliminate the risk of camera shake and motion blur by using those faster shutter speeds. But the faster your shutter speeds go, remember, the higher that ISO is going to creep up as well. So if we're going to photograph our dog, for example, we'd want to be using fast shutter speed like 1,000th of a second, maybe 500th of a second. But to be safe, I'd be looking at 1,000th of a second. I guess it depends on how fast your dog is as well. And you go and photograph it on a beach. Now, if it's grey and overcast, I can use 1,000th of a second, but the ISO is going to be creeping up. So if I want to do a nice big print of my dog charging across the beach, I'm probably going to wait until it's a sunny day, so I know I can get that shot at really fast shutter speed, and the ISO won't be going up too high, so the quality of that image is compromised by that. So these are the sort of things that we start to think about. Once we start moving off of auto, we can start thinking about how's the light impacting the decisions that I make with the settings that I change. So don't worry if that sounds a bit too much for you right now. We're just dipping our toes in, but it's good to sort of keep in the back of your mind that exposure triangle that I showed you at the beginning, and how that's impacted by the light of what we're in the scene that we're taking photographs in. So it's a good exercise just to keep that in the back of your mind. So shutter priority is my sort of go-to setting that I will walk around with most of the time in shutter priority, because it does allow me to change that shutter speed. And if a red kite or something suddenly flew past me, I'm already in 500th of a second, I can take that snap and I don't have to worry too much. And it, like I said, it removes that most common issue where you have the camera shake or motion blur from the subject moving. So it's a really key setting to keep your camera in. It is really quite helpful. So in terms of reading our camera and understanding what's happening when we're changing through those shutter speeds is quite a good exercise to do. So get your cameras turned on, go up to your fastest shutter speed. Mine's 8,000th of a second. Yours might be 2000, 4000, depending on the camera. I think on this one it will be about 2000th of a second. So now find a dark area, cupboard, point it in a dark corner of a room, and you'll see that if nothing's flashing at you, your ISO will be going up very high. And if I go even further down here, it goes up to 12,800. Now if your ISO doesn't go up that high, so even though I'm not going to take that picture because I know that I won't be able to get a print out of something with that high ISO, but if your ISO doesn't go that high, you will see your aperture start to flash at you because the camera can't let enough light in to take that picture. And when you see that, so if you got that, wait for it to get a bit darker and try. So once the sun goes down, if you can't find a dark enough cupboard, go to 8,000th of a second or 4,000th, whatever it is, and you'll start to see that F numbers flashing at you, and that means that there's not enough light coming in to take that photo. And if you take that photo, you'll see that it's too dark. Let's go the other way. So let's go up to, let's try 5 seconds here. So 5 quotation mark or 5" mark. Yeah, so again I've got the F number flashing at me, and you need to do this in a light room, don't do this at night. Do this outside the window will be fine. 5 seconds and the F number's flashing at me, and I know that that's going to be too bright to take the picture. It'll take the picture, but it will be completely white when that comes out. And it's recording now, and you'll see completely white. So that's part of understanding, reading our camera and understanding what's going on, is to look at that bottom row of numbers. If something's flashing at you, there's a problem. There's either too much light coming in or not enough light coming in. So there is some limitations with shutter priority, and that's it really. The key thing is there's a danger that if you don't notice that flashing light, that your pictures are going to come out too dark. So in the moment, if you're using really fast shutter speeds and there's not enough light, if you're caught up in the moment and you're not looking at the bottom of the camera, you're going to end up with some darker images, or the other way around, so brighter images. So the pictures will still take, but the exposure won't be correct because you haven't looked at the bottom of the camera and responded to it. So that is one of the dangers. And so when you're changing your shutter speed, the aperture that the camera chooses between varies from lens to lens. So on here it's something like 1.8 to f16. On here it'll be something like f3 to f8, so it's a much smaller range for this to choose from, and it changes camera to camera, lens to lens. So that is the limitation of the shutter priority mode, but it is a really good camera mode, and as I said, my go-to camera mode, because it just has that ability to freeze the action. And especially if you're photographing kids and stuff, like, you know, so many people come to me, it's like, oh, every photograph I take of kids, of my kids is blurred, and that is the reason. It's because your shutter speed is too slow. So it's an instant fix straight away for photographing kids. And if then you start to think, well, if I want to do a print of the kids, I need to use it in brighter conditions. So instead of doing it in the dark dining room, I'll photograph them in the conservatory or in the garden where it's lighter, and I can use faster shutter speeds and get better photographs. So these are all things that start to kick in the more you start to do it and the more you start to think about it. The other great thing about using shutter priority is that you can reflect movement in different ways by choosing your different shutter speeds. So in this exercise here, I use a windmill which is being spun. If you're at home and you haven't got one of these windmills, you could use a bike wheel and turn the bike upside down and turn it with the pedal. Or you could just get someone to move an arm for you, and you can do it just as effectively this way. So the idea is to go from 500th of a second or 1,000th of a second if you want to go really faster, and freeze that action. So you can freeze the action with those fast shutter speeds. Then go down to 100th of a second, and you can see that the motion starts to creep in. There at a 30th of a second, you can see even more movement happening, so the suggestion of movement is there. So I told you I think at handheld you don't really want to be going slower than 200th of a second, but for this exercise that's totally fine. And then again at half a second, so 0.5, you start to see there's no identifiable leaves on this flower. It's all blurred into one and the colours are starting to blur together. So there's 4 very different feeling shots just by changing our shutter speed a few times, a few different versions of our shutter speed. And if you think about that in terms of if you were photographing a race, like a cycle race or a sport or some animals, you can reflect very different feels just by what shutter speed you choose. And that's a great tool to have in your kit when you're going out and photographing something. So I think I have some examples here. So here we go. So we've got the kingfisher that's been caught at 1,000th of a second. You can see that the kingfisher's wings are still slightly blurred. So even at 1,000th of a second, the speed of the wings hasn't been frozen. So if I wanted to freeze those wings, I'm going to have to be looking at 2,000th, 4,000th of a second, which means I'm going to need brighter days to be able to do that. Again, so landscapes where we're blurring that water, this is photographed at a half a second. 1/8 of a second is quite a good sort of time to go for. This one's half a second, but 1/8 of a second is quite good for fast moving water. And again, on a really bright blue sky day, I would really struggle to get down to half a second because it was too bright, and the camera wouldn't be able to go that slow without the picture starting to turn white and too bright. So again, we're deciding what we're photographing based on the lighting conditions. And then here we're going to look at this technique called panning later on in the course, where we've got a 15th of a second and we've managed to keep the deer sharp, but the motion blurs still suggesting movement. So at 15th of a second up to 1,000th of a second or half a second. Again, I should probably point out this is on a tripod. I can't hold a camera still and get a sharp picture at half a second as much as I'd like to try to be able to do that. I can't. So 3 very different pictures taken at very different shutter speeds, suggesting different things. So hopefully that gives you an idea of the power that you'll be able to have now that you can control your shutter speed. And we're going to look at aperture priority next.